Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to welcome David Meredith to talk with us this afternoon and share his research. David Meredith is a researcher at Teagasc, the Irish Agriculture and Food Development Authority, and he leads national and EU research teams that aim to improve understanding of the nature of farm safety and farmer health challenges, and use the results of the research to inform policy discussions and development, and develop practical supports and tools for farmers and farm advisors. Now, he does have a very lengthy bio here, and there's a lot of expertise gathered here, but I think what I'll do is hand over to David to talk you through some of his recent research. He actually previously presented at the Farmer Health Symposium in Canberra last year, which raised a heap of interest. And so we've been very lucky to have him actually visit the centre this week and agree to give us an update on his work. So throughout the presentation, David will pause to answer questions. So please pop your questions in the chat as we go, in the Q&A section. And he will answer those at various points. We'll also have time at the end for further questions. So with no further ado, I will welcome David to the stage. Thanks, David.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction and welcome, Alison. From my point of view, it's a great privilege to be here. I got to know the work of the centre through Susan and her collaborations with my colleague John McNamara, and then I got to know Alison. And then as I developed my own research programs in Ireland, I was heavily influenced by the work that the centre had done. And that resulted in me asking Alison to chair the scientific advisory group for an EU project called Safe Habitats. And we'll talk about that project in a little bit of detail shortly. But it's really this relationship that's developed over quite some years now between the two institutions, so Teagasc and the centre. And it's the benefits that we've gotten from working together have been really, really important for informing what we are doing in Europe, but also in Ireland as well. And as we go through some of this, there will be questions, I hope. I really, really, really hope there are questions, because an hour of me talking is an hour too much. I'm going to try and keep the presentation relatively, well, we'll keep it to 40 minutes anyway, but please do ask questions. And even if it's to make a comment and to suggest something, maybe you see similarity, maybe you see differences, these are always really valuable for me to understand. So on that point, I will try and share here. So Alison has done some of the heavy lifting on this in terms of introducing me. So I'm a senior research officer. I'm also the head of Teagasc's Department for Agri-Food Business and Spatial Analysis. And as I was saying to somebody earlier today, that doesn't really give a lot away. But basically, we're a group of social scientists. So there are sociologists, there are geographers, there are psychologists, and there are other people from the behavioral sciences who work together. And really what we're trying to understand are behaviors and patterns of change. And I'm also the PI, or the principal investigator on the EU Safe Habitats project. To say just a tiny bit about Teagasc, it is, within the Irish context, it's a large agricultural research, education and extension organisation. So we would have about 1,500 staff members, a budget of about 200 million per year, and the division of resources across the organisation, it's really split into a third, a third, a third. So a third on research, a third on extension, and a third on education. And on the education side of things, we have colleges. So this is where people who generally want to go on to become farmers, they would go to college and they would either get a certificate or a diploma as a result of going through our courses. If they wanted to go on to complete a degree, they can do that, but they do that with one of our university partners. So that's the education side of it. We then have our farm extension side. So we have about 300 farm advisors. So they work directly with about 45,000 farmers. And those farmers are generally on the more commercial end of the spectrum in Ireland. So we have a wide variety of different types of farm enterprises and also scales. But within Ireland, many farms will be dependent on all farm source of income, and many farmers themselves work off farm. Teagasc's focus would generally be across the spectrum. We're not selective or we don't exclude, but generally we would have a lot of commercial farmers, particularly from the dairy and tillage sectors. But we also have beef, sheep, and horticulture as well. So you get the sense from that there's a huge emphasis on livestock, which is, anyone who knows Ireland would understand we're very good at growing grass, and we're really good at converting grass into protein. And the question is whether that comes in the form of meat or milk. And then there's the research element of Teagasc. So this is the directorate that I sit within. It's made up of a range of programs. I work within the Rural Economy Development Program, and I'll talk a little bit about how that fits into Teagasc's strategy in a moment. The whole purpose, though, of Teagasc is that we work together. Okay, it's not just that we've got a group of researchers doing their thing and we've got a group of advisors doing their thing. The idea is that we're collaborating and working together. And that provides a very unique and really interesting environment in which to work, because it offers opportunities to people like me to get a much better grounding and understanding of what the issues and challenges are that farmers face and the lived realities of the challenges that they face in trying to adopt some of the recommendations that we might make from research. So I kind of view this from the lens that it cuts out the nonsense that can come from researchers who are a bit more detached from the realities on the ground. And it's certainly my hope that by engaging in engaged research, that we can have greater impact. And that's a lot of what I'm about personally. So in terms of moving on, where my work fits into Teagasc is Teagasc has a series of strategic goals. Every organization has them. Mine fits into goal 1, which is really about enhancing the social sustainability and health and associated with that health and well-being of farmers and farm families. So that social sustainability piece is important from 2 points of view. There's the impact on well-being and quality of life. And then and this is the if part, if we are successful in that area, can we then improve the attractiveness of farming? Okay, so that's why are we doing this at all? Well, we have, like many countries and similarly here in Australia, we have an issue with regard to the age profile of farmers in Ireland. The average age is 57. And if you are a beef farmer or a farmer with a beef enterprise in Ireland, the average age is about 62, 63. So you can see quite an elderly age profile to that farm population. Dairy farmers would be the youngest of them all, and they would be about, on average, 53 years of age. So that gives something of a context there. But the challenge is very much around what we would call generation renewal or farm succession. And improving the attractiveness of farming is a key challenge here because it is a sector where the working conditions can be very challenging. And I will talk about working conditions in a moment. But in terms of some of the work that I'm doing, anything that you see in bold here is work that connects with my own. And so I've looked at aspects of identity. So, in terms of that idea of sustaining family heritage, traditions, and business practices. So this is really important, in terms of that identity, that family connection to land, to place, very important in terms of the motivations and drivers of behaviors, in terms of what might be adopted or not adopted. Also on farm succession as well. And I should just note that when I talk about social sustainability, I'm actually referencing something quite specific here. So you can dig into what social sustainability is from a kind of conceptual point of view. And what I'm drawing on is Valence et al.'s breakdown of what social sustainability is. And they distinguish between maintenance sustainability. Okay, so, trying to sustain things that are of value to us. Okay, and to give a kind of a simplistic example here, in the face of adapting to climate change, we're being encouraged to change our the modes of transport that we use. Okay, and one of the more attractive ones for people is to say, okay, well, I'll buy an electric car. Okay, now maybe not if you're living in a remote or rural area in Australia, you're not going to go there, but it's a simplistic way of saying, I will make a change, but it's not going to make a difference. And it doesn't make a difference because at the end of the day, I still have a car. Okay, so I've maintained what I need to maintain without making any real change on the ground. So this is what maintenance sustainability is. Bridge sustainability is where somebody tells somebody, society needs you to do something, so you need to make a change. Okay, so that's the bridge sustainability piece. And I'm much more interested in that maintenance sustainability because it's what people are willing to do. It's what are they going to adopt, what are they not going to adopt. It's understanding the reasons for that. Then in terms of the quality of life and well-being, we've done work on physical health, mental health, issues around community connections and isolation, work-life balance. The pieces where other colleagues have done some work around financial security, access to education. I've done work on the healthcare side of things, and then community resilience and social capital in rural areas. And then finally, in terms of that attractiveness of farming, we've got issues around working conditions and working in and with nature, which is some of my own work in that space. And I'll touch on some of these things as I go through the presentation. In terms of, before I go on, I'm not sure, are there any questions around what Teagasc is, who I am, what I'm doing here? Okay. The other part of my work is as leader of this project called Safe Habitus. So Safe Habitus is kind of a first of its kind in the European context. It is the first time that the European Union, through its Horizon Europe funding mechanism, has put money into understanding health and safety on farms across Europe. Okay, the total budget is €5 million. The project started in January 2023 and runs to December 2026. So from my point of view, the clock is really ticking on this thing. It involves 12 countries and 20 partners. And you can see the green blobs on the map here are the countries that are involved in the project. So we've got people in the north, south, east, and west. And the mission of this project is to improve working conditions for farmers and farm workers. So it's an important distinction here. We're not just thinking of the farmer. We're thinking about all the people who are contributing labor on the farm. And we seek to improve those working conditions by reducing occupational injuries and fatalities, and thereby enhancing the social sustainability of EU food systems. So that's our overall mission. We've got 4 objectives, and these objectives were set by the European Commission. They relate to enhancing understanding of the challenges faced by farmers and farm workers. And what's really interesting is how that objective was written, because we were told that we had to enhance the understanding not of farmers and farm workers of the challenges that they face, because they know the challenges better than most. It was to enhance the understanding of policymakers of stakeholders and of various different representative organizations of the challenges faced by farmers and farm workers. Okay, so it was a very interesting way of framing part of the problem here in terms of a lack of understanding, not amongst farmers and farm workers, but amongst the wider policy stakeholders, the governance systems that exist out there. And that relates to kind of two other objectives, which is about improving policy and governance frameworks within the EU on one level and at national level on another level. And the reason for that is that the EU has very limited competence in relation to health and safety. So and I'm going to get to probably my bugbear around some of the issues here, some of the challenges that we face. The EU doesn't really have a role in the space of regulating most farmers and their working conditions. And that's because most farmers and farm workers are actually family workers. So there are about 17 million people in Europe who contribute labor to farming. And in excess of 86% of those are family members, are self-employed farmers. And under EU regulations, they don't get regulated because they're self-employed or they're family workers. So they're not covered by any health or safety legislation. And this gets even more problematic because they're not covered by any health and safety legislation. It is voluntary on the part of the member states whether or not they report accidents or injuries or fatalities affecting this population. So the EU, through Eurostat, which is the official statistical agency, publishes a report every year, and it says that, yeah, farming is dangerous. It's about the 5th or 6th most dangerous occupation in Europe, and there's about 315 people per year killed on farms across Europe. And of course, this is not right. This is not correct. This is an estimate made up of very partial data. And where this really comes to a head is that you look at some countries across Eastern Europe that don't report any data relating to self-employed farmers. So if you take Romania, for example, there's over 3 million farmers. And they don't report information for self-employed farmers. You look at France, huge agricultural country. They don't report data for self-employed farmers. And on it goes, right across Europe. And this just means that when it comes to policymaking, the policymakers don't have the basic information or data on which to base their decisions. They don't know the level, they don't know the causes, they don't know the consequences, they don't know the cost. And in the absence of these things, policymakers are very slow to act. There's very little impetus there for policymakers to actually step into this space and do something about it. And it's something I'm very, very passionate about. I mean, it's a strange thing maybe to be passionate about statistics and data collection systems, but until we begin counting people, they're not going to matter. There is that saying, what gets counted matters. Well, we're not counting farmers, so do they matter? And this is what I'm trying to change and what my colleagues across the Safe Habitats project are trying to change. Well, one of the parts that we're trying to change. There are many other elements to the project as well. And this is what the project looks like. And this is a very complex system, but stay with me here. Basically, the project is based on communities of practice. And we have 11 of these in 11 different member states. And the communities of practice bring together farmers and the network or the ecosystem of service providers and supports that surround farmers. And the reason we include these two groups is that the perspective I have and had when I was writing this particular project was one of not pointing the finger at farmers saying, you should do something, you should improve your safety, you should stop, etc., etc. Because I know when someone does that to me, it's not very effective. I generally don't do whatever it is that person is trying to tell me to do. But if we can influence and improve the structures and supports that surround farmers and farm families, then it becomes easier for people to adopt new practices and new behaviors because we begin to break down the barriers. Okay, so that's the purpose of the community of practice. But these are very, what we would call bottom up. They're community-based. So the idea is that they identify their issues. What are the issues for them? So it's not about me saying, oh, I know best. Okay, so this is very much a case of saying, what are your issues? What are the things, what are the concerns, and how do you see them? So how do you define what these issues are? And working together, this community of practice, then begins to tease out and prioritize some of these issues in a thematic way to say, okay, well, we've identified our priority list here, and now we're going to go into detail on 3 or 4 of them. And this is what we call our practice abstracts. Okay, so each one, maybe, you know, somewhere around 800 or 1,000 words, but it just drills into it. It defines it. So instead of saying livestock safety is an issue, it's like, okay, well, for whom is that an issue? And in what way is livestock safety an issue? Like, is it in general, is it animal attacks? Is it animal handling? Is it around facilities? What's going on here? Why is this an issue? So get a much better understanding of that. And then there's the aspect of who needs to do what in this space, okay? Because is it a case of we need better training? Do we need better supports around knowledge in terms of animal handling? And I pick on this one intentionally because a lot of people would say, you're not going to go on a farm and you're not going to tell a farmer how to handle livestock. They've been doing it since they could walk. And on one level, that could be true, except for the fact that I've seen this at work. And I've been a part of it myself. So I, you know, in terms of if I'm prescribing something to somebody, I tend to do it first myself to see, well, what do I think if it's going to work? And what I found is we organize this livestock training, animal handling, so how to move livestock safely. And it was very interesting. We got in a brilliant trainer from the UK, and she went through the process of really getting us to understand how does an animal perceive the world. And that was fascinating, and got us into this space of thinking very broadly, not about how we want the animal to behave, but how the animal will behave, and then how do we interact with it. But we did this on a farm. And on the first day, we ran 2 groups through this. And on the first day, the farmer stood back and he was like, yeah, I've seen this all before. You're not going to teach me anything new. On the second day, the farmer and his whole family were there because they were all learning something. And it was that opportunity to see something different and hear something different from somebody who was very engaging, who spoke their language, that they really appreciated it and they engaged with. And afterwards, they talked about telling their friends about this training and the fact that they would love to do more. So it's an example of, you know, how even if we can stand back on the outside and say there's nothing that we can teach farmers here, well, actually, if done appropriately and a way that doesn't seem to force it down someone's throat, maybe there are opportunities there for people to learn. So this is the piece about the practice abstracts. It captures those approaches. It captures what those issues are and the approaches and who needs to do what. And very frequently, it's not about the farmer needing to do something. In that case, around the livestock training that I spoke about, that training was provided to farm advisors. So it wasn't about saying, oh, farmers need to do this. This was more a case of training farm advisors. And we capture the 12 practice abstracts and we bundle them up, and that's going to be the national report for each of our 11 communities of practice. And they feed into our national policy form. So again, putting this on the table of national policymakers and enhancing their understanding and awareness. And then bringing that up to the European Union level. And that photo is myself and my colleague, Alan, who works on the project, who leads out on the policy side of things at the European level. And the person in the foreground is Maria Walsh, who is a member of the European Parliament. And this particular event was focused on mental health issues in agriculture. We share the practice abstracts widely. Okay, so we have a Safe Habitats Knowledge Hub, and we share that information also through something called the EU CAP network. And that's quite passive in terms of like it's out there. okay, but we need to get engagement with it. And that's where the transnational community of practice really comes into its own. So this is where all of the communities of practice get together. And it's a case of saying, well, we're experiencing this issue over here in Ireland. And Romanians ever say, oh, no, we've dealt with that problem. We've got this potential solution. And that's what that transnational community of practice is about. So really, like when you step back and try and simplify what this project is all about, it's about knowledge exchange, but it's about engaging with people in their terms, at their level, to get their expertise and to share that widely as we can. And this is the process that we've developed. So that is the Safe Habitus project in a nutshell. And I'll come back to that next slide in a second. I'm not sure if there are any questions around all I just presented there. If there are, I'll take them. Alison.
I just wanted to ask about the practice abstracts. So each community of practice develops a single abstract. Does that have within it multiple challenges that they're facing, or are they choosing one? How does that work?
Yeah. So each community of practice will choose about 4 individual topics, and they will develop a practice abstract around just that topic. And in fact, in some instances, what they've done is they've chosen a priority topic and they've developed 2 practice abstracts around the same topic, but different elements of it. And it really is, it's up to them in terms of how they approach this. And ultimately, it's really about what they're going to find of most value to them. I'm not sure, was there a question online? Oh, there's something in chat. Okay, so do deaths on farm data include suicide as well as accidents resulting in death, or is that captured elsewhere? Okay, thanks, Lucy. So death from suicide in general is not counted as part of the farm fatality data, and I will be talking about that specifically in relation to the Irish context shortly. Is it captured elsewhere? At a European level, no. We have very limited data on mental health amongst farmers in Europe. A lot of anecdotal information, a lot of cross-sectional studies, but we do not have European level data here because it, in general, is not captured at the occupational level. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So moving on. So in terms of, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but this is where the project is about improving working conditions and labor conditions in agriculture. And the difference between the two here is, I mean, is there a difference for a particular purpose that this slide was developed for? I distinguish between working conditions for self-employed farmers and employers, and I discuss labor conditions for people who are employed. Now, whether they're getting paid or not is a whole different thing, because a lot of family members wouldn't get them paid remuneration. So this is where I was trying to be inclusive, okay? Whether these distinctions are real, that's a whole other thing. But when we break down what makes for good working conditions or quality jobs, what we see here are things around fair income, secure employment, safe working conditions, equal opportunities, social protection, personal development, and freedom of expression. And this gets us away from thinking about, what makes farming attractive from this big bucket stuff, and begins to break it down and say, well, hang on a sec, if we break it down and think about it like this, we can actually make progress, because there are things that we can do in these spaces. So the fair income relates to economic viability. And in this space, we could look at economic viability and go, well, where does that come from? Well, if we're going to change things there, we need to seriously look at how food value chains work, who's getting the profit out of that, and if that can be altered. In Australia, you've got this wonderful duopoly with all the power, and farmers in the bottom of that with relatively little power. And that's not an unusual situation. We've got the same thing in Ireland. We've got the same thing right across Europe. But it comes to the point in terms of, rather than saying to farmers, okay, you know, we kind of recognize that there's some sort of problem with income here, but what can we do about it? Well, by using this type of framework, it really draws attention to the fact that something needs to be done about it. And we should not ignore it. The secure employment, I mean, this is an interesting one for me because on one level, you know, you look at farming and say, well, you know, you're self-employed. It's very secure. You're not about to, you know, fire yourself. But the reality is that it's an increasingly precarious occupation. You know, when you break that down and look inside what's going on within the occupation, it's increasingly precarious in terms of income, in terms of working hours, in terms of the conditions under which employment takes place. So there's a whole set of issues, and you can go right across the spectrum here, looking at these various different issues. The one that I would draw attention to, though, is that social protection piece, because this is where we can, and certainly I've overlooked this area in the past, but it's so important. Okay, so this is not about agriculture policy. This isn't about saying agriculture policy should do something. This is about basic social protections that exist out there. And I, in my very privileged position as a researcher who works for an institution, have great social protection, okay? But farmers, because they're self-employed, or family members, because they are not technically employed, don't necessarily have great social protection. And it depends on whether they're paying into the systems or not. And I refer you back to the fair income piece. Can they afford to pay into these systems? So this is where that social protection piece becomes really, really important. So if a farmer has an injury, can they afford not to work? Is there someone else there to pick up the slack? Well, in many instances, no is the answer to that question. So this is just a framework for thinking about, you know, how do we go about improving health and safety in agriculture? And in terms of that social protection piece, what I would point to there is that when we look at the data in Ireland, and we collect all data relating to any fatality that occurs on a farm, and we distinguish between those that are farm-related and non-farm related, okay? So, sorry, any fatality on a farm is farm-related, but if it's a death from suicide, that's excluded from the data. So that's just clarification on that. So it doesn't matter if the person is young or old, or if they're a worker or non-worker. In the Irish context, that data is collected. And when we look at the data in Ireland, what we find is that the people who are being killed on farms in Ireland generally are over 65 years of age. The vast majority of people who are being killed on farms in Ireland are over 65 years of age. And we ask, why is it the case that there are so many people in the Irish farm population exposed to this? And it's because they've got to keep working. Farm incomes are low. There is no form of retirement there, so the farmers can continue on working into old age. And they're encouraged to do this by the policy system. So under the Common Agricultural Policy, farmers receive payment so long as they continue to work. So older farmers continue to work. And I've done the analysis on this, and I've seen that basically the injuries that we see people on farms having don't really differ between older and younger farmers. It's just that if you're older, you're more likely to die from that injury compared to a young person. So this is where a good social protection system with some form of secure retirement income could actually make a huge difference to health and safety on farms in Ireland. And that's why they're an important part of certainly my thinking. I'm going to move to the issue of mental health amongst farmers. And I'm approaching this from quite a critical perspective, from an Irish and an EU point of view. And what I mean by that is at the moment we can see there's a lot of attention coming into this area. It's a relatively new area of concern in the European context, and it really emerged post-pandemic. And I think largely driven by the public awareness of the impacts of the pandemic on mental health, but also some of the positive aspects that people began to get a language or a vocabulary to talk about these issues. And farmers began talking about these issues. So this led to growing policy concern, and I can look at the Irish and the European context, and I see lots of activity in this space, okay? A lot of public concern. So again, you look at newspaper articles in Ireland, the UK, but also in France and other places, and you see huge concern with regard to issues of mental health and well-being, stress, and suicide. And then there's this kind of ballooning area of research that's focused on mental health, including well-being, stress, occupational stressors, and anyone working in this space can't but have noticed just the massive volume of literature that's kind of emerging right now on these types of issues. But and this is me being reflexive about it. I did some early work on this, and later on I kind of stood back and went, actually, that wasn't good work. And it really, I wrote it in a hurry, and I hadn't fully considered what I was doing. And afterwards, it made me kind of look again at the literature and said, hang on, I'm not alone here. There's a lot of people talking about issues that maybe we should be much more careful about talking about. And it began to make me take a much more critical perspective on what might be or might not be happening with regard to things like stress and well-being. So working with one of my colleagues, Diana Van Doren, Diana is a health researcher. She's done some brilliant research on cardiovascular health of farmers. And more importantly, she's focused on trying to find ways that are practical, that can support farmers and reduce the risks of cardiovascular disease. As part of her work, and something that we've done recently, is to begin to look at stress and well-being. Okay, so some of the early work that I spoke about there in terms of saying, okay, well, what do we know about Irish farmers and stress? One study that I was involved with asked a question, which I would never ask again, but it was, have you experienced any of the following stressors in the previous 5 years? Okay, and 57% of farmers experienced at least one stressor in the previous 5 years. Now, being self-critical about that, I'm kind of astounded about what were the other 43% doing. Okay, because farming is a stressful job, modern life is stressful. So what was going on there? So this is where, for me, I kind of stood back on this one. We need to be a lot more careful about what we're doing here. But it did highlight that, yes, 57% of farmers experienced at least one stressor in the previous 5 years. And when the same piece of work was repeated in 2021, it was 40%. And this is important. Not the figures, not the overall level, it's the variability. Stress goes up and it goes down. And the types of stressors change over time. And we need to have that perspective in mind. In line with a lot of international research, we found that dairy farmers recorded the highest prevalence of stress. Okay, so that was 74% in 2018, said they experienced at least one stressor, which had declined to 55% in 2021. And the most common types of stressors were things like workload, weather, finances, and change. And change here is really pointing towards things like farm succession, planning for that, and policy. So that's that piece in terms of what do we know about stress. In terms of well-being, well, actually, we didn't know anything. Okay, but Diana is part of her work where she collected data from over 900 farmers, and we'll talk about the results from 800 and something odd farmers very shortly. But she measured well-being using the short work Edinburgh scale. Okay, and that's framed from a positive point of view, so you can see the constructs here in terms of things like I've been feeling optimistic about the future, and then there's a frequency. Okay, none of the time, rarely, some of the time, often, all of the time. And then you add up all these scores, and there's a system whereby if you achieve a certain sort of score, you're put into a different category. Okay, and that ranges from poor to very good. And when we look at that in what those data look like, what we see is really what's standing on the right-hand side of the graph there is that actually the largest group of farmers have excellent well-being, and then we have a group that has good well-being, and then we've a mid-sized group in the middle that's average, and then we get to the below average and the poor. The difference between the colored bars here, the dark colored bars, are all farmers. The lighter color is those people with a beef enterprise, and the lightest color of all is dairy farmers. So this is actually really interesting, because if you look at that excellent piece, you find, well, actually dairy farmers have excellent well-being. So what's going on? And we began to think about this in terms of, well, what's the relationship between stress and well-being? Because in policy discourse, they're frequently conflated, as one thing being the same as the other. And frequently mental health is being conflated with well-being. So as part of Diana's work, she measured stress using a single item validated scale as part of the health check. And this is, this statement was read out by a nurse to the farmer who is in getting the test, and it was explained what stress might feel like. And then they were asked, do you feel this kind of stress these days? And then there was a 5-point Likert scale varying from 1 to not at all. 1, which is not at all, to 5, which is very often. And our basic hypothesis here was that there would be a direct relation, a linear relationship. So as stress increased, well-being would decrease. That's not what we found. Okay, so we found that there were instances where farmers experienced stress to some extent, but they were below average in terms of well-being. Okay, we found that there were farmers who experienced stress often, but they had average well-being. Okay, and this was at time point 1. So this is baseline. And the data here, this is a matched sample, so a longitudinal data set. So they're the same people at the 2 different time points, okay? They're dairy farmers, so we're focused in on those for the moment. And there's 199 of them, okay? And the reason there's 199 is because we had 199 matched pairs of data. And then when we move forward, we find that, well, actually, there's just no relationship whatsoever between stress and well-being. And this brings me to my first set of conclusions around this, which are kind of obvious to anyone working in this space. So most farmers, yes, they do experience some form of stress, but only a small proportion experience stress frequently or constantly. And really, that's where our priority needs to be in terms of identifying these people. When we look in our data, we don't see a particular demographic, so it's not younger or older. We see both, in terms, so we can't put our finger and say this type of farmer is the one that we need to go after to provide them with additional supports and services. So, it becomes a complex thing. There's no significant relationship between stress frequency and poor well-being. Okay, so this actually points to something that I think is really, really interesting. And it's the protective factors associated with farming. That yes, it can be a stressful occupation, but there are good things about farming that provide protective factors out to the individual. So it could be the case that the stress is for a short period of time. Farmers know the harvest will come in and that stress will pass. Or it's that they've been here before. They've experienced this before, and they know this too will pass. But there's also the positive benefits that we get from being in nature and working with nature. And if you look at a lot of the psychology literature and stress and well-being in a general sense, and particularly in urban areas, people talk about the value of blue space and green space, and people should spend more time in nature. Well, farmers, by dint of the occupation, spending most time working in nature and with nature and working with livestock. And these things are known to be protective. So that's that piece on stress and well-being, and I'm not sure if there are any questions around that particular piece of work before I move on.
Like I'm hogging the floor. I'm not sure if there's anyone on the call from the Regional Wellbeing Survey, but I know that they've been looking at some really interesting data now across 10 years, which was showing farmers generally have quite good wellbeing, but it's when they're exposed to cumulative stressors, so multiple kind of stressful situations, that their wellbeing starts to deteriorate. Just interested to...
So I'm going to go back up here and look at these two figures. So this idea that 57% of farmers experienced at least one stressor in the previous 5 years, that data was collected in 2018. And in 2021, the same question was asked again. What was the difference? So in 2018, Ireland, and this may sound very strange for anyone who knows Ireland, experienced a very severe drought. So we went from for us, a long cold winter. So animals were housed for a prolonged period of time. So they came into housing very early in the year, and they had to stay housed for a very long period of time. We then went into spring, which lasted all of about 3 weeks. And I'm not really exaggerating about that. And then we went into a drought that lasted for months. And we just don't have those sort of conditions in Ireland. So this was very out of the box. So the weather piece here was important, but it wasn't just the only issue. So what we had are animals that were housed on a consistent basis. And if you think about the period under which this housing was taking place, you had farmers who were housing animals with calves, and the risk of animal disease associated with that increases, particularly where they've got a mixed system like dairy and beef. So that became a stressor for them. But they were housing animals and having to feed them. So now it was a case of, where can I get fodder from? And Ireland as a country effectively ran out of feed for animals. And we had to go to France, and we had to go to the UK, and we had to go to other countries to get that feedstock to feed animals and keep them alive. And some farmers were faced with effectively culling out animals in terms of going, okay, I can't keep all of the herd, I need to get rid of some. Okay. And let's not underplay that. Okay, because in many cases, these are genetic lines that have been built up by farmers through very careful and selective breeding over a long period of time. So this is something that they're very invested in. And the idea that, well, let's just cull out 10% is not something that is easily done. There's the workload behind all of this. You know, it's more work. And of course, there's the cost side of it. So it's all of that accumulates together. It's not one stressor, it's now 5 different stressors that come together, and the impact on various different systems. And then of course, on top of this, farmers being human beings, they're affected by other things. They're affected by things like marriage breakup, by people dying that are close to them. So this is where this can become really problematic. And it's where I think about this issue in terms of a Venn diagram with 3 circles. You've got the business, you've got the personal side, and then you've got the occupational piece, okay? And in many instances, like in our lives, there's good separation between that economic piece, the occupational piece, and our personal lives, and there's only a small little overlap in the middle. For farmers, there's actually a huge overlap between all of those circles. So the potential of one thing impacting on the other becomes very great. So that's a whole other presentation, but thanks for the question.
Just a point on that protective bit. Doesn't every occupation have some protective aspects, or is that peculiar just to farmers?
In terms of that exposure to nature, that working in and with nature is something that is different for particularly farmers. But, you know, I mean, there are other rural occupations as well, or extractive industries, maybe, that you can say something similar about, in terms of that there's that greater engagement with nature. But farming, there is a unique element to it, that it's working with nature. and that it's not just the extractive side to it. So there's that aspect of seasonality, of planting, growing, new life, and so on. So there's those elements that come into it that are quite positive, and it's that temporal or rhythmic seasonal piece to it as well. That time is passing and being part of that. Whereas I sit in an office and what's the difference? It's kind of like, oh, it got darker earlier. It's clearly winter. Yeah. I'm now going to move on to a very sensitive issue for me, and I imagine for most people. Oh, sorry, there's actually a question in the chat there. Lucy, do you think the physical activity of the job is also protective? Well, interestingly, Lucy, so Diana did collect information on physical activity and found that farmers are not as active as they think they are. And that the occupation isn't necessarily as healthy as we might perceive it, or the general public might perceive it, and certainly as farmers might perceive it. So the work that Diana did in this area, she did talk to farmers about their levels of physical activity, and they viewed it as a very healthy occupation because of that being outside, working with nature. But when Diana collected information around diet and exposure to cardiovascular health risks, she found that farmers had a much larger number of cardiovascular health risks compared to the general population. And diet wasn't good, activity wasn't good. There was a lot of lifestyle factors that came into play. But thankfully, Diana, rather than just measuring the problem, went and did something about it, and she designed a really interesting program to support farmers to adopt healthier lifestyles and put in supportive frameworks around that to help them. And that was very successful. So, but maybe I think the key point, Lucy, is that the aspect of physical activity, definitely being outdoors, that is protective, that aspect of being in nature, but the level of physical activity isn't as great as it certainly once was. A lot of mechanization. So the idea of spending 8 hours a day in a factory isn't the healthiest. So on this topic of suicide, so this is an issue that's very sensitive. And how I'm presenting this is it's looking at this through the lens of data and statistics. And the issue here is anytime we reduce, something like suicide, deaths from suicide down into data and statistics, it can seem very brutal. It can seem to be very dehumanizing. And in terms of everything that I'm going to say here, I don't want to take away from the fact that the data I'm presenting here represent tragedies for all the people involved and their families. But I engaged with this particular piece of work because there's a huge focus within Ireland, but also across Europe in terms of suicide amongst farmers. And we see this internationally, and there's work that was done in Scotland indicating 31 deaths per 100,000, in France 36 deaths per 100,000, the US 22 deaths per 100,000. But when we step back and say, okay, there's a bit of variation in those, what we see is that rates are higher than the general population and higher than those for rural populations. So, we're saying there's something going on here for farmers. Okay. But a lot of the discourse around policy and in the public was informed by anecdote. In Ireland, and certainly that is the case in the EU, an anecdote is very, very powerful in highlighting key issues, highlighting the nature of tragedies, the causes sometimes, but it's not a good basis on which to design policy. And I wanted to get a much better understanding of trying to develop an evidence base for policy, specifically in relation to Ireland. And my aim was fairly simple, which was to estimate a crude death rate, so death by suicide amongst the farm population in Ireland, and within that, to describe the number of deaths, to calculate calculate a crude death rate, explore issues related to age, and look at the trends over time. And look at what are the limitations? What can we know? What don't we know? So our data comes from coronial records. So if someone dies from suicide, there is a coroner's report, and that is established that they have died from suicide, and that is reported to our central statistics office. And as part of that recording process, the occupation of the deceased is captured. Okay, and we went to the CSO, the Central Statistics Office, and we asked them to extract data out for us. They would provide us with some data, but very limited data because of the sensitivities around this and because of the possibility of statistical disclosure. And when we asked about the occupational side, they actually pulled out some of the descriptors there. And what we saw was examples of business owner and farm, or farmer and electrician. And this instantly creates a problem for someone like me, because what am I dealing with here? Am I dealing with a farmer and an electrician? And if there's an occupational issue here, which occupation is the issue? So this is, instantly I'm kind of beginning to look very critically at these data and say, well, what exactly do these data tell me? I see there's a question there, so I'm just going to take that. So Sharon May, what impact do you think language has on the impact of confinement? Stress seems to be a term that is more acceptable in the work. Interesting question. Work martyr, masculine stereotype. Are farmers happier to admit to stress than other well-being terms? I don't know. But that's a really interesting question. So thanks very much for that, Sharon. I'm not sure if anyone else has an answer to that, but it's really interesting. Maybe we'll come back to that. So key point here in terms of the data is that it's not only farm holders or full-time or sole occupational farmers that are included in this data set that was given to me. So that then created a problem in terms of thinking about, well, how do we calculate the rate? But before we got to that, let's describe what we're seeing here. Okay. So in the period between 2007 and 2020, this is what we see. In Ireland, there were a total of 6,616 people who died from suicide. And for those that had an agricultural or farm occupation term, in the coroner record, there was 457. And then when we see the average number dying annually, we can see with regard to farmer agriculture, that's almost 33. The standard deviation is 6, and the minimum was in 2019 of 22, and the maximum was 45 in 2013. So very significant variance around that. But when we look at the overall, we see that farmer agriculture account for about 7% of the total fatalities for the period 2007 to 2020. And the question then becomes one of, are farmers overrepresented in the data? And I calculated this for 3 different time points, and I took a denominator here, which was the total farm workforce. Okay, because I couldn't distinguish between full-time farmers who died from suicide versus those with a part-time occupation or any other type of occupation, I was left in this situation where it's like, okay, I have to make the assumption that that there are all types of people from across the entire farm workforce in this data set. So you can see here the estimates for the total size of the farm workforce, and you can see the total population over 15 years of age. And then we've got the farm workforce as a percentage of that population, and the proportion or the percentage of deaths from suicide associated with farmers or agriculture. And effectively, the figures are in line. Okay, it seems that farmers are not overrepresented in the data using this particular denominator. If I used a different denominator, of course, this figure will change. and change drastically. So if I assumed it was only full-time farmers that were in this category, well, it would double the percentage of people, double that. So we reduce the farm workforce by half and effectively double the deaths from suicide associated with farmers. So how does the rate compare between farmers and the total population? And the key point here is it varies over time. Okay, so what we see here is the blue line is the general population rate, and the orange line is the farm rate, or the farmer/agriculture rate. First thing to note is that rate varies around, yes, but it's somewhere between 16 per 100,000 and 10 per 100,000 for farmers. And there's much greater variability amongst the farm population than the general population. What we see is a trend, an increasing trend up to the point of 2013, and a decrease from there to the point where it's broadly in line by 2020 with the general population. And I should have said when I was talking about the coronial data reports that there's a long data lag in terms of deciding if deaths from suicide, how they're recorded, and when they get incorporated into the data set. So hence the data that I had last year when I was doing this work related to 2020. The question then becomes one of, is there a significant difference between the suicide rate, or the death from suicide rate, of farmers and the total population? And if you take the whole period, the answer is yes. But if you break the period into two equal periods, you find that yes, there was a significant difference between 2007 to 2013, but no in the period since then. So that higher farmer rate relative to the population rate between 2011 and 2014 strongly influences the analysis. And what we've seen recently is that the rates have converged. So this is a real issue here, in terms of when we measure something and report it, we can capture something at a very specific point in time, and we need to be thinking about how are these trends playing out over time. Someone is probably going to ask, why have we got this big spike in 2013 and in the period coming up to it, and afterwards it begins to decline? And the reality is, I don't know, and we don't know. We've sat down and discussed this. We have a number of kind of propositions around this, but we don't really know. What we can point to is that there was significant change affecting the industry at that particular point in time. A lot of policy change, a lot of drive to intensify, to scale up, a lot of change in wider society as well. A lot of things that might have challenged identity, but the simple reality is that I can't put my hand up and say I know the answer to that question. There is a question there. Kimberly Brown, does the suicide data include unemployed people? Unemployed population may have a different suicide rate compared to those in occupations. So yes is the answer to your question. So the general population, the rate of death for suicide includes people who are unemployed. The one thing I would point out here is that for many very small farm enterprises in Ireland, the individual will be underemployed. And there's work that a colleague of mine did a number of years ago, and it was interviews with farmers who had attempted suicide. One of the common features, there weren't that many people, it was qualitative work, obviously it was incredibly sensitive. But one of the common features there was issues around underemployment. So it was that aspect that they really struggled with, that underemployment part and sense of purpose. So what about older farmers? And I'm going to be very quick on this because I want to get to the end. Older farmers, as I said at the very beginning, represent a very large proportion of the total population of farmers in Ireland. So bear that in mind when I present these data. it's not proven possible for me to be able to identify the right denominator here. So I can't calculate a comparable rate to what I presented already. So what you're looking at here is raw numbers. Okay. What I can say is that 27% of the deaths from suicide amongst farmers are associated with people over 64 years of age, so 65 and above. And that compares to the national figure of 10%. So there is the question of what's going on here. Okay, is this simply an artifact of the age structure of the overall farm population? Or is there something else going on here in relation to isolation, loneliness, untreated mental illness? So there are questions here. And the fact that there's very little variation in this rate is also of concern, because it doesn't seem to be responding to something. It's just bobbing along. So there is more questions than answers on this particular slide. But international research does highlight that older farmers are at greater risk of dying from suicide. So perhaps what we're seeing here is in keeping with that. So, conclusions with regard to suicide. First and foremost, there's significant limitations in what I've just presented. If I was to talk about this in terms of the paper that we're writing here, I mean, effectively, it is a paper about the limitations of using these types of data. Okay, normally when we write a paper, there's like a couple of paragraphs at the end where we talk about limitations. The way this thing is coming out, it's like a paper about limitations. There are real challenges here. The need to distinguish between different groups of farm workers. That's something that we can't do right now. The other thing that we can't do is distinguish deaths caused by occupational factors and any other factor. So mental health, mental illness. New Zealand has taken a step towards doing this. It's not great, it's not perfect, but they have at least tried to distinguish between this issue of occupational means of committing suicide and other means. And in that, they found that 11 deaths out of 30 could be attributed to occupational means. I'm not sure what this actually means, in terms of, okay, someone might have used occupational means to die from suicide, but the other 19 people that we're talking about here, that doesn't take away from the fact that they've died from suicide. They were farmers, and that farming may have played a role here in terms of their death. But for me, it points to the fact that we need a much better understanding of what are the factors affecting that decision to attempt suicide, or in the most tragic outcomes, to complete suicide. And to understand things like health. What is the role of health in this? There's data, and I was talking to Russell Roberts last week, and he was making this point that, a lot of people who die from suicide are in ill health and suffering from pain. So, there's a question mark about underlying health here. And perhaps if we begin to focus on the health piece, we get to the preventative piece. If we begin to deal with health problems of people who are suffering from a mental illness or depression or anxiety, perhaps we can save some lives. The other piece that I want to focus in on here is just that aspect of when we talk about death from suicide within farming, I'm really conscious of the need to, let's not assume that farming is the problem. Okay. Yes, farming is an incredibly important part of any individual who works in this sector. It is a very important part of their identity, but there are many other factors going on in everyone's lives that have very little to do with their occupation. And we need to not just understand the farming part of that, but we need to understand and see the whole person. So that's the that piece. And then there's also the other factor that there are many, many positives from farming in rural life. Okay. And let's not underplay them. And the point that I would make, the point that I am making here, is to really conclude by saying that, let's not ignore those positives. Let's highlight those, because when we're engaging with farmers, or when I'm engaging with farmers, that tends to be where I want to start that conversation. What do you like about this? As opposed to what's wrong. Because if we start from the negative and the deficit, that might not be helpful. And focusing on those positives can help bring a perspective. But it's really important that we do that sensitively, so that those people who are experiencing challenges, that they don't feel that they can't talk to us, or at least can't talk to the service providers that they're engaging with. And with that, I'm going to conclude. But I'd like to thank you once again for your attention. And if you have any questions at all, please ask. I'm happy for these slides to be shared. And if you want to contact me afterwards, my email is there. So thanks very much for your time. Any questions or last comments? I realize I have gone 15 minutes, 11 minutes over.
Thank you, David, for that excellent presentation. I have a million questions, but I know I won't keep everyone here today just to listen to all my questions, and they'll have to be discussed at a later date. But thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We do have another question just up on the screen here. Oh, no, it's a thank you from several people in the audience. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. A great presentation, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much.